This is not how empires lose their grip. There are no declarations, no treaties signed in defeat, no ceremonies marking the transfer of power, just a single sentence spoken with confidence that quietly severs a relationship built over generations. And by the time the consequences become visible, the structure has already shifted beyond repair. Most people heard it as political posturing, a negotiating tactic, the kind of statement designed for domestic audiences, not international strategy. America said it did not need Canada. It said this publicly. It said this while Canadian supply chains were feeding American factories, while Canadian energy was powering American cities, while Canadian minerals were enabling American technology. And it said this without recognizing that necessity in geopolitics is never one-directional. History does not repeat the same mistakes. It creates new versions of old patterns. And this pattern, the pattern of a dominant power misreading its own dependencies, has appeared before. Britain believed its colonies were replaceable. The Soviet Union believed its satellites had no alternatives. And in each case, the moment of realization came too late, after the infrastructure of separation had already been built. What happened after that statement was not a crisis. It was a recalibration. Canada did not collapse. It did not panic. It simply began building what it should have built decades earlier. And America, in its confidence, did not notice until the construction was already complete. I have studied how nations lose strategic advantages. It is never sudden. It is always structural. And it always begins with a miscalculation about leverage. The statement itself seemed minor at the time. It was framed as strength, as independence, as a refusal to be constrained by relationships that appeared one-sided. American officials believed they were negotiating from a position of power. They believed that Canada, as the smaller economy, as the resource supplier, as the northern neighbor with limited alternatives, would have no choice but to accept American terms. This belief was not irrational. For 80 years, the economic relationship between the two countries had followed a clear pattern. Canada extracted resources. America processed them. Canada shipped raw materials south. America sent back finished goods. This arrangement was convenient for both sides, but it was not equal, and everyone understood this. What American strategists failed to recognize was that convenience over time had transformed into dependency. Not Canadian dependency on American markets, though that existed, but American dependency on Canadian inputs that could not be easily replaced. The supply chains were not simple. They were integrated across multiple industries, multiple states, multiple decades of investment and specialization. When America said it did not need Canada, it was speaking from a position of historical memory. A memory of a time when American industry was self-sufficient, when American factories could source domestically, when American energy production met American demand, but that time had passed quietly while attention was focused elsewhere. And the statement revealed that American policymakers had not updated their understanding of what the current relationship actually was. Canada heard the statement differently, not as a threat, but as a release. For decades, Canadian economic policy had been constrained by the need to maintain access to American markets. Trade disputes were resolved in America's favor. Energy exports were priced below market value to ensure American buyers remained satisfied. Infrastructure investments were designed around the assumption that the primary customer would always be south of the border. The statement changed that calculation. If America did not need Canada, then Canada did not need to structure its entire economy around American preferences. And this realization, once it settled into policy circles in Ottawa, began a transformation that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. I do not speculate about what Canada might do. I observe what it has already done. And what it did in the 18 months following that statement was construct alternative infrastructure at a pace that surprised even those who were building it. The Port of Churchill, in Manitoba, had been a regional facility, useful for grain exports during the brief ice-free season, but not a strategic asset. Within 16 months of the American statement, Churchill became the focal point of a transportation corridor that bypassed every American port and connected Canadian resources directly to European and Asian markets. This was not a symbolic project. The investments were real, the infrastructure was functional, and the shipping routes, once established, began drawing cargo that had previously moved through American territory. Canadian wheat no longer needed to travel through American ports to reach international buyers. Canadian minerals no longer required processing in American facilities before export. Canadian energy could move east and west, not just south. American officials noticed this, but they did not interpret it as a strategic threat. They viewed it as inefficiency, as an expensive attempt to prove a point. They calculated that Canadian products would still need American markets, regardless of which ports they used. And in the short term, this was partially correct. But infrastructure is not built for the short term. Once the rail lines exist, once the ports are operational, once the shipping contracts are signed, the patterns do not reverse simply because political rhetoric softens. The Canadian executive, who spent 2 years developing relationships with European buyers, does not abandon those relationships when American trade negotiators suggest renewed cooperation. The Asian manufacturer who secured reliable Canadian supply no longer depends on American intermediaries. This is where leverage shifts. Not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. The energy sector reveals this most clearly. Canada supplies over 4 million barrels of oil per day to the United States. This is not discretionary supply. American refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast were designed specifically to process heavy Canadian crude. They cannot simply switch to lighter domestic shale oil without extensive retooling that would cost tens of billions of dollars and take years to complete. When America said it did not need Canada, it implied that this dependency was manageable, that alternative sources existed, that Canadian supply could be replaced or reduced without significant disruption. But the engineering reality did not support this assumption. The refineries themselves told a different story. Facilities in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and along the Gulf Coast had been configured over decades to handle the specific chemistry of Canadian heavy crude. The distillation columns, the catalytic crackers, the desulfurization units, all of it was calibrated to extract maximum value from oil that flows thick and sulfurous from Alberta as oil sands. This was not a simple preference. This was mechanical dependency, encoded into billions of dollars of fixed assets that could not be repurposed without effectively rebuilding the facilities from foundation to flare stack. The engineers understood what the policymakers did not. You cannot run Saudi light crude through a system designed for Canadian heavy and expect the same outputs. The yields are different, the processing temperatures are different, the chemical additives required are different, and the economics, once you factor in the cost of retrofitting versus the cost of securing Canadian supply, were never actually competitive. Canadian energy companies understood this. They recognized that American refineries were locked into Canadian supply by infrastructure and equipment specifications. But they also recognized that this dependency would only last as long as no alternatives existed for Canadian exports. Once Canadian oil could reach Asian markets directly, once Canadian natural gas could flow to European buyers without American transit fees, the leverage would equalize. The geography had always been the constraint. Canadian oil and gas production sits in the interior of the continent, thousands of kilometers from tidewater. Moving that energy to international markets required either pipelines south through American territory or pipelines west and east through Canadian terrain that was more expensive to traverse. For decades, the southern route was cheaper, and that cost differential gave American buyers implicit leverage over Canadian pricing. But cost differentials change when alternative infrastructure exists, and the statement accelerated decisions that had been deferred for years due to political and financial complexity. If America believed it did not need Canadian energy, then the risk calculation for building export capacity shifted. The question was no longer whether to build alternatives. The question was how quickly they could be made operational. The pipeline and terminal investments began immediately, not as retaliation, but as basic risk management. If America believed it did not need Canadian energy, then Canadian energy companies needed customers who did, and those customers existed in markets that were willing to pay premium prices for stable democratic supply. Trans Mountain expansion, which had faced delays and political opposition for years, suddenly became a national priority. The regulatory obstacles that had blocked progress were reframed as sovereignty issues rather than environmental debates. When the choice was presented as dependence on American goodwill versus independent access to global markets, the political calculus shifted in ways that had seemed impossible just months earlier. LNG export terminals on both coasts, previously considered marginal investments given American market access, became strategic assets. The natural gas that had been flowing south to American power plants could just as easily flow west to Asian buyers who were paying significantly more per unit and whose demand was growing rather than plateauing. By the time American policymakers recognized what was happening, the construction was already underway, and once infrastructure investments of this scale begin, they do not stop due to diplomatic pressure. The capital has been committed. The contracts have been signed. The strategic logic has been accepted by everyone except the country that triggered it. The Asian buyers move first. Japanese and South Korean utilities, seeking alternatives to Middle Eastern oil and Russian gas, signed 20-year purchase agreements with Canadian suppliers before the first export terminal was even completed. The contracts were structured to guarantee Canadian revenue regardless of American market conditions, and once those guarantees existed, the financial viability of the infrastructure was no longer dependent on American demand. European energy companies followed. German industrial consumers, desperate to replace Russian gas supplies lost after geopolitical ruptures, committed to Canadian LNG imports at prices that made the trans-Pacific shipping economically viable despite the distance. The Europeans were not buying energy. They were buying reliability from a democracy that would not weaponize supply during diplomatic disputes. I have watched this pattern before, not in North America, but in other regions, where dominant powers misread their dependencies. The response is always the same. Initial disbelief that the smaller partner would actually build alternatives. Then frustration that those alternatives are being constructed. Then alarm when the alternatives become operational. And finally, negotiation from a weaker position than existed before the statement was made. The critical minerals sector followed a similar trajectory. Canada controls significant deposits of lithium, rare earth elements, cobalt, and other materials essential for batteries, electronics, and renewable energy systems. For years, these materials were extracted and shipped to American facilities for processing. This arrangement made economic sense when American processing capacity was the only option at scale. But the statement created a different calculation. If America did not need Canada, then Canadian mineral resources did not need to be processed in American facilities, and once that assumption was questioned, alternative arrangements became possible. European companies, desperate to reduce dependency on Chinese mineral processing, offered partnerships that included technology transfer, joint ventures, and guaranteed long-term purchase agreements. Asian manufacturers, seeking supply chain security, committed to building processing facilities on Canadian territory. In both cases, the terms were more favorable than anything Canada had previously negotiated with American companies. The minerals did not disappear. They simply stopped flowing south. And American technology companies, American defense contractors, American battery manufacturers suddenly found themselves negotiating for access to materials they had previously taken for granted. This is what dependency looks like when it becomes visible, not through interruption, but through competition. American buyers were not cut off. They were simply forced to compete with other buyers who were offering better terms. And in that competition, the historical assumption that Canadian resources would always be available at American prices quietly dissolved. I am not describing a crisis. I'm describing a transition that is already complete in structure, even if its full implications have not yet been recognized. The demographic dimension adds another layer that most analysis misses. While other developed nations face population decline and aging workforces, Canada engineered sustained population growth through immigration systems that select for economic productivity. This was not accidental. This was policy implemented consistently over decades that created a growing domestic market and expanding workforce while competitors struggled with labor shortages. The statement from America did not change this trajectory, but it did change how Canada positioned its demographic advantages. Instead of viewing population growth primarily as a way to support American supply chains, Canadian policy began emphasizing domestic consumption, domestic innovation, and the attraction of international investment that was not routed through American partnerships. The technology sector responded fastest. Canadian cities began competing directly with American tech hubs for talent and investment. And they won more often than expected because they could offer stable immigration status, lower costs, and access to a growing market that was increasingly independent of American approval. This was not brain drain in the traditional sense. This was the emergence of parallel ecosystems that no longer defined success as proximity to Silicon Valley or access to American venture capital. Canadian tech companies began raising capital from European and Asian sources. Canadian research institutions began partnering with non-American universities. Canadian startups began designing products for global markets rather than American entry points. And each of these shifts, individually minor, collectively represented a structural separation that compounded over time. The network effects that had concentrated technology development in American coastal cities began to diffuse. And once diffusion begins at this scale, it does not reverse through policy statements or renewed partnership offers. The financial implications are becoming visible in ways that cannot be ignored. Foreign investment into Canada increased by over 40% in the year following the American statement. This was not speculative capital. This was long-term infrastructure investment, manufacturing facility construction, and research center development by companies that were actively seeking alternatives to American-centered supply chains. The capital was coming from European pension funds, Asian sovereign wealth funds, and multinational corporations that recognized the stability premium of a democratic, resource-rich country that was no longer structuring its economy around a single customer. And that capital, once deployed, creates economic relationships that persist, regardless of political rhetoric. American officials eventually recognized the scope of what was occurring, but by then, the response options had narrowed. Trade negotiations that might have been productive 18 months earlier were now complicated by the fact that Canada had alternatives. Pressure tactics that might have worked when Canada was dependent on American market access were now ineffective because Canadian exports had been diversified. The most revealing indicator came from American corporate responses. Major manufacturers began relocating facilities to Canadian territory to ensure supply chain access. American automakers committed billions to Canadian battery production. American technology companies established Canadian research centers, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was dependence on supply chains they no longer controlled. This is what structural change looks like. not government mandates, but corporate decisions driven by risk assessment. And those decisions, made independently by hundreds of companies across dozens of industries, collectively represented an acknowledgement that the relationship had fundamentally changed. The military and security dimensions are less discussed, but equally significant. Canada's role in NORAD, in NATO, in Five Eyes intelligence sharing, had always been understood as junior partnership, valuable but not essential. The assumption was that Canada needed these relationships more than America needed Canadian participation. The statement tested that assumption. And what became clear, though it was never stated explicitly, was that Canadian geography, Canadian Arctic access, Canadian early warning systems, and Canadian contributions to collective defense were not as easily replaceable as American officials had believed. Other NATO members noticed this. European allies began treating Canada as a more equal partner, rather than as an extension of American positions. This was subtle, but it was real. Canadian diplomats found themselves included in discussions from which they had previously been excluded. Canadian military contributions were solicited more actively. Canadian positions in international forums carried more weight. This was not because Canada had increased its military spending, though that occurred. This was because the perception of Canadian independence, of Canada as a country with options rather than a country with constraints, changed how other nations calculated the value of Canadian partnership. And America, having triggered this recalibration, now faced a situation where Canadian cooperation in security matters could no longer be assumed as automatic. It had to be negotiated. A negotiation requires acknowledging mutual dependency, which contradicted the entire premise of the original statement. I observe patterns, and the pattern here is unmistakable. The statement was intended to strengthen America's negotiating position. Instead, it revealed dependencies that America had not fully acknowledged and triggered responses that eliminated the leverage the statement was meant to demonstrate. This is not unique to this relationship. This is how power transitions occur in systems where economic integration has created mutual dependencies that are not equally understood by both parties. The dominant partner assumes that integration benefits the subordinate partner more. The subordinate partner, once that assumption is challenged, discovers that the integration created vulnerabilities for both sides. And once that discovery is made, the relationship cannot return to its previous form. The timeline matters. 18 months is not long in historical terms, but it was sufficient to construct alternative infrastructure, establish new trading relationships, attract international investment, and demonstrate that Canadian economic independence was not theoretical but achievable. And once achieved, even partially, the psychological dynamics of the relationship shifted permanently. American negotiators who returned to the table with renewed partnership proposals found themselves facing Canadian counterparts who no longer operated from a position of necessity. The discussions were polite, the language was diplomatic, but the substance was different. Canada was no longer negotiating to maintain access. It was negotiating from a position of having built alternatives. This is what the statement cost, not in immediate trade volume, though that declined, not in political rhetoric, though that shifted, but in leverage, in optionality, in the structural position that allows one country to assume compliance from another. And leverage, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to recover, because the infrastructure that was built in response to its loss does not disappear simply because the original threat is withdrawn. The ports remain operational, the trade agreements remain in force, the investment relationships remain productive, and the corporate and governmental decisions made during the crisis period become the new baseline for future planning. I am not predicting what will happen next. I'm describing what has already occurred. The separation is not complete. The relationship has not ended. But it has been fundamentally restructured in ways that cannot be reversed through policy statements or diplomatic initiatives. America said it did not need Canada. And Canada, in response, built the infrastructure to ensure that its prosperity did not depend on whether America maintained that position. This was rational. This was predictable. And this was the moment when 80 years of assumed dependency quietly transformed into something approaching parity. History does not announce these transitions. It records them afterwards, when the consequences have become undeniable. But the transition itself happens in ordinary decisions, unremarkable investments, and bureaucratic processes that accumulate into structural change. We are watching that accumulation in real time, and the statement that triggered it will be remembered not for what it intended to accomplish, but for what it accidentally revealed about dependencies that neither country had fully understood. By the time this is taught in universities, the narrative will be clear. A dominant economic power, confident in its position, made an assumption about a relationship it thought it controlled. That assumption was tested, and the testing revealed that the control was mutual, that the dependency was bilateral, and that confidence without accurate assessment is not strength but vulnerability. The moment has passed. The structure has shifted. And what was said cannot be unsaid, because what was built in response cannot be unbuilt. This is how history marks change, not with drama, but with consequences that compound until they become irreversible.